welcome to the John H. Ames reading series, and hello from the Jane Popieski Heritage Room of Nebraska Authors in Bennett Martin Public Library. I'm Diane Wilson. I'm curator of our collection, and I'm really happy to welcome you to this program, which is being held on Zoom. Today's event, just so you know, is being recorded, and it'll be made available on the library's YouTube channel at a later date. So for those not familiar with our service, the Heritage Room's mission is to preserve and promote literature and works by and about Nebraska authors. It's funded by an endowment supported by the Nebraska Literary Heritage Association, which was established through the Foundation for Lincoln City Libraries. And we're really grateful that they help us. It makes events like this possible. So the Ames Reading Series serves as a venue for authors to share their works with our community. And today is the 226th program since this series began in 1985. And today we're really pleased to host author Chris Harding Thornton, who is a seventh generation Nebraskan. Just as a little bit of an introduction for Chris, she holds an MFA from the University of Washington and a PhD from the University of Nebraska, where she's taught courses in writing and literature. Chris also, in her bio that's on the book, it says she's worked as a quality assurance overseer at a condom factory, a jar lid screwer at a plastics plant, a closer at Burger King, a record store clerk, and an all ages club manager. Also, she's been a PR writer. Her book, Pickard County Atlas, is her first novel. So just to let everybody know, we're doing our program a little different today. In the past, our interview between the author and the curator was taped before the program and then made available later in the recorded program. But today we wanted to try something different, and we're going to have our interview right now. So you'll get to hear us live, me asking Chris the questions and her answers. And at the end of after the interview, then Chris will do a reading. And if you have questions that come up during the interview and the reading, just feel free to put them in the chat function, and we'll be able to address them at the end. So let's get started. So welcome, Chris.
Hi, well, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really honored.
We've been talking for a little bit here, getting to know each other and having fun conversations. So I do want to ask you first to tell us a little bit about yourself, kind of biographical information.
Well, like the bio says, I'm a seventh generation Nebraskan. My family, a lot of the lines have been here since the territory, since Nebraska was a territory, but I grew up kind of all over the place. I had a huge extended family. I had 11 grandparents when I was born. I was lucky enough to have one of them passed actually just before Christmas this year. So I had them for a very, very long time, and they influenced me quite a bit. I lived just outside Irvington as a kid, and went to Irvington Public School, and then that was closed. And then I moved out toward Bennington, Nebraska, and lived just outside of Bennington, Nebraska with my grandparents for quite a while. And then I lived in Omaha for a bit. I popped down to Lawrence, Kansas for a few years. I lived in Sioux City for a little while. I lived in Seattle, Oakland, California, Los Angeles. Oh, I think that's it. And then I came back. I look like a drifter on paper is what it is.
Then you came back to Nebraska.
I did, yeah. Yeah, and now I currently live in Wahoo, Nebraska, which is just west of Omaha and north of Lincoln by about equidistance, about 30 miles.
Mm-hmm. So, well, I already said where you attended school, and so tell me what was your area of study as an undergrad? And
as an undergrad, I started out originally as an opera major when I first graduated from high school, and that it just wasn't for me. It was a really small school, and I realized that's not where I thrive. I thrive in a larger environment where I can kind of disappear into the background, and then I really get things done, which is good for writing. Um, so I did that for a bit, and then I just took classes just to see kind of like, am I interested in anything, on a part-time basis for a while. Eventually I realized that the entire time, well, since I could write, which I could write at a pretty early age for a person, I'd been doing that all along, and it just seemed really, I realized talking about writing and writing were my favorite things. So that's what I ended up pursuing. At UNO, I uh, was in the writer's workshop, the undergraduate writer's workshop,
Mhm.
and also an English minor in American literature.
Great.
Oh,
So,
and I guess then the MFA was in fiction, and my PhD was in English, uh, with a creative writing emphasis. But I also did a lot of critical work on Great Plains authors, and Wright Morris and John Neidhart and Ralph Ellison were specifically things that I was really interested in.
okay. So that kind of leads into my next question of what influence has Nebraska and the Plains had on you and your writing?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't, there was a time when I was out in Seattle where I was, studying writing with really wonderful people, had an amazing mentor named Charles Johnson who wrote a book called Middle Passage that won a National Book Award. And if you've never read it, you really, really should. Uh, but I was having a hard time writing. I just felt like a fish out of water. Like I felt like I needed to get back to Nebraska to be able to write. I think I mean, the place has shaped, it's who I mean, it's shaped who I am.
Uh-huh.
I don't think that I could, it's difficult for me to be extricated from Nebraska. I think, it's just, I guess it's all of my experiences here, have shaped the way I see the world, you know.
Hmm. That makes sense to me too, having like you lived here and gone different places and come back. This is the third time I've lived in Nebraska, so it always does draw me back.
Yeah, it'll pull you back in.
Yeah. So what about you have mentioned this, but other people, who's been most significant in your writing? Was it Neihart and Wright Morris and or
I think Wright Morris, the I can't understate probably the influence that Wright Morris had on my work, but also, Ralph Ellison is huge. His essays and his speeches, and also Invisible Man. Um, uh, Mari Sandoz, I think, doesn't get quite the credit, the huzzah that she deserves. I love Mari Sandoz a lot. Um, yeah, there's so many. There's just so many. Melville, obviously, but like, James Welch's Winter in the Blood was just a big, it was kind of a watershed moment reading that book. That felt so right to me. Just talk about like place and the importance of place in the shaping of people, and just the first paragraph of that book just captures that better than I think I ever could.
so so we're talking about a lot of authors that have influenced you, and so I get the sense then you've been a reader then for all your life as well.
Yes, yeah. And I should say, I think that the book that propelled me towards writing more than any other is a book that I don't think a ton of people have read. There's been a movie about it. I would suggest reading the book. The movie's great, but read the book. It is by Patrick McCabe. He's an Irish writer. He wrote a book called The Butcher Boy. I read the book I think I was 22 or 23. I was in my apartment. I read it in an afternoon and I was so moved. And what really got me was that the voice of the narrator just stuck with me for like
Mm.
a week, where I would just hear it narrating things as I was walking around, and I was just like, "That's magical." And so that I think that propelled me more toward writing. Before that, I was just a really avid reader. I read everything I could get my hands on, and I didn't read kids' books because when I lived with my grandparents, there weren't any kids' books around
Mm.
anymore. There were the high school kids' books. So in fourth grade, they were like, do a book report, and I did it on Grapes of Wrath. And the teacher was like, "What are you doing reading that book?" And I was like, "It's good. It's a good."
That's amazing. I love to think of that. Well, so so when did you start writing? You said that really early.
The first thing I wrote, it sounds so improbable, but the first thing I wrote was in kindergarten, and it was a letter to my mom about a it was about a field trip that we'd taken to a farm where, and this is funny because it actually shows up in the book a little bit. A tree had been hit by lightning and caught on fire inside of the tree, and it had been all hollowed out. And I was really stuck with the image of standing inside of that hollowed out tree as a kid. So the first thing I wrote was in kindergarten. It was a letter to my mom about that.
Wow.
Yeah.
Do you still have that? Or does your mom still have it?
I have it somewhere downstairs. It's not legible, but I know that that's what it's
So you started then.
about.
Um, so when did you know that you wanted to be a writer? I guess, yeah, defining yourself as a writer. When do you think that happened?
Um, I decided to just go all in when I was 23. I was working at a record store, loved that job, best job ever. Uh, but I thought, I realized like I had committed myself to not committing to anything because I always wanted to have my options open. And when it just hit me one day, and it was after I'd read that Patrick McCabe book. I just
Mhm.
said, you know what, I why not commit to the thing that you've been doing all this time? And that was when the actual commitment happened. I want to say that was 23.
So then you went on, is that when you were working on your MFA in Seattle or?
No, I decided to take a few classes at UNO at the writers
Oh,
workshop. I just kind of
oh, it
wanted,
was then. Okay.
yeah, I just wanted to see, you know, I kind of wanted to hear if like I was terrible at it. It wouldn't mean that I wouldn't write. It would just mean that maybe I would just write for myself.
Uh-huh.
Or maybe I would try my hand at writing stories. And the feedback that I received from people like Richard Duggan at the writers workshop just encouraged me to continue. And so for better or worse, that's what I did.
You
I
did.
stuck with it. Yeah.
I'm looking down here at my different questions. So I think you kind of touch on this, but well, maybe I haven't asked this directly. Have you always felt like you needed to write? Is that something that you need to do?
Yeah, I think it's something that I do pretty compulsively anyway. It's if I'm not doing it like sitting down and actually like writing out the words, I'm doing it in my head. Like it's just a constant thinking about. And I think I had mentioned to you when we were talking earlier, like I think that the reason why I I really get sucked into trying to figure out how the world, to me language is a really imperfect medium.
Mm-hmm.
It's all symbols, which means it's all generalizations. Like when you say the word pen, it's not this pen or that pen or this specific thing. It's just a generalization. So, like trying to make the world real through something that's an inherently kind of, a medium that's hindered. I think that's something. I think I'm not good at language or good with language, and that's what propels me to write the same sentences like over and over again. And also the sound, like I always know that there's a sound, a certain number of syllables that needs to be in each sentence. Yeah.
Oh, okay. That's
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah, and capturing voices is really important to me. Like, I think capturing voices for posterity, or trying my best to like render, like I had this gigantic elderly extended family growing up, and
Hmm.
I I that one of the first things that you kind of forget are voices, but I've managed to hold on to those and hold on to those as hard as I can, and I try to put them where they fit into writing sometimes.
Uh-huh. So let's talk about Pickard County Atlas. Just a little bit, what inspired you to write it? I love the book, by the way. I know I told you that before, but I
Thank
really
you.
enjoyed it.
Thank you very much. Well, okay, and I mentioned this, but one day I sat down to write and I heard this voice just like just chattering in my head. And it ended up being chapter 11, which is a Pam chapter, Pam Reddick. Um, so she started the whole thing. It sounds like I'm blaming her. But she really was the thing that it came from, I think. And then what sustained it was a lot of times when I sit down to write, I just want to be someplace like for a while. I just want to
Mhm.
be someplace that I'm not for a while. And Pickard County and the town of Madison, were places that I wished I was, or I wished that I could be. And so I lived there basically in my head for, years. And it was, yeah, I just wanted to know this little slice of earth as
And
well.
at that time, like that time period as well, because isn't it set in the 70s? Is that correct?
1978.
Okay.
Yeah, which is about the time that I really started. I have a couple of straggler memories before them, but it was about the time that I really started to remember things. And I think, it's part of it's nostalgia, but then it's also more complicated than nostalgia. It's
Mhm.
not, um, I wouldn't say it's a nostalgic book, but it's sort of like, I think 1978 feels like it was, on the cusp of something. And really a lot of stuff had been happening. There's a whole history, obviously, before that moment, but uh, it was right before the 80s farm crisis really, really hit a fever pitch that I don't think has ever really come to a resolution necessarily. So I think that was part of it. I think, so a bit of nostalgia to take me back there, but then also like looking at like what would it mean to have lived during that period of time, sort of.
And someone like Pam,
Yeah.
who she really kind of, would the word be defied role, the role of a woman in society. I mean, she had other aspirations.
Well, and I don't know, I think Pam, I don't know that she had other aspirations. She knew that what she was doing wasn't right. That it
Yeah.
just that she'd gone through the motions. She'd done this thing that she was, that everybody did because it's what people do. You get married, you have kids. Um, but she realized that she couldn't, it wasn't her. It just wasn't her. So yeah, I think I was trying to understand what that would be like for a person, to make those decisions at a really young age, and then also to feel, yeah, like, why have I done the things that I've done just because that's what people do?
Right. I guess, I mean, it would take a lot of courage to, I mean, I'm sure she'd be faced with a lot of judgment. So,
Yeah, I'll say the character has been faced with a lot of
oh, yeah,
and I get it. I do. I completely understand, but she was in a difficult situation without the emotional resources or the physical resources that she needed to make this a sustainable way to live.
right. So, now I'm going back to just ask you more about the process of writing. What's your best way of working? So this question, I agree, these were good questions. I did not come up with these questions. They've been used for quite a number of years, and I haven't really changed them because they seem to, we get some great just responses from authors. So do you have a set time that you work, or is it early morning, or do you work for long periods of time, or do you do short periods? Do you have a
Yeah,
practice kind of?
I do. It's not the healthiest practice, I don't think, in the world, but I'm just like, wake up if you have a if you can, um wake up and start writing. For a while, that meant waking up at 3 o'clock in the morning and working until 9, then getting ready for work and going and working for 8 hours, 10 hours a day, and then going home, going directly to sleep, waking up at 3 a.m. and starting all over again. Um, when I was in school and teaching, it was kind of reserved for, anytime I could get all of my teaching stuff done in a 4-day period, and then I would use 3 days to just work on writing. Then in spring breaks and things like that, the entire time it would be like, okay, I've got 2 weekends and a full week. That's all that's happening. And I would exist on string cheese and cashews sometimes, and just live in that world and write in that world. So some days it doesn't happen and the well's just empty, and you sit there for 11 hours, you end up with a paragraph, and then other days you spend 16 hours and you forget and you think you're only out there for 2 working on it. I used to have a shed, so when I say out there, I'm talking about the shed, but yeah, I'm inside the house now. But um yeah, and then revision. I mean, so that's all drafting, but then revision, I would have to have about 8 or 9 days just cut out where nobody was around, and I had nothing else that I was really obligated for or obligated to. And I would start at the beginning of the book, and I would work forward every single day until I could get through the entire book twice in one day. So,
Wow.
yeah, really just doing nothing else, I think.
It's really a discipline, it sounds like then,
Or an unhealthy fixation or something. Yeah.
well,
Yeah.
this is something I always wonder when you were saying some days the well's empty. So how does that feel? I mean, that sounds like it would, to me, in my world, really painful. I mean, really unpleasant. Does it feel like that? I always ask people this about that are doing creative things.
Yeah, it does. It puts you in a really bad spot. I think it really it's you get really down and you get really demoralized. And sometimes the best cure for it is just to pick up a book and read,
Oh, yeah.
and then you're like, oh right, it's just words. it's they're imperfect. You just do the best that you can, and it'll kind of break me out of writer's block unless I read something where it's so incredible that I'm like, well, I don't need to write anything anymore.
Oh, gosh.
This person took care of all of it in this short story. It's usually a short story that'll do that to me, where I just I'm just amazed by what people do. But
Uh-huh.
yeah, it sometimes also I think doing something physical like outside of your body, building things, painting things, sanding things, I think that sometimes that can really, really help you balance out what's going on in your head and that empty well, and it gets you, motivated. You get the immediate satisfaction of seeing like, okay, I fixed that chair or I built those
Mhm.
shelves. Um, and it just gets you out of your head a little bit, I think.
Yeah. Um, I mean, I guess I do that myself in other areas too. Get just getting out and getting the perspective.
Yeah.
Just yeah, clearing out my all those little voices. Yeah, or the ones not the right ones.
It's,
So,
I think gardening is another one. Gardening, there's nothing like gardening to break me out of funk, I think.
uh-huh.
Yeah.
So, um, I don't think we really addressed this. Where'd you get your information for Pickard County Atlas? Who'd you talk with when you were doing your research? Or did you talk to anybody?
That's funny. I mean, I really enjoyed taking workshops in school because it gave me deadlines. And every once in a while, someone would point out because it just makes you make something, whether you want to or not.
Huh?
You have the deadline. So that was helpful. I think every once in a while, someone would say something in class that would really propel me forward. Um, but as far as like just the research and stuff about the world, a lot of that I'd written a book prior to this, Road to Thatcher, which was my dissertation at UNL, and it was about a walk I took from Norfolk, Nebraska to Valentine, Nebraska
Wow.
in 14 days. Yeah, on the Cowboy Trail. The year that it flooded and all the bridges washed out. It was kind of a disaster, but amazing. And I met a lot of people along the way. I think a lot of it I got from my grandparents also. Um, I had to call a friend, Jerry, who's a lawyer, an amazing lawyer in Omaha, once to ask him about what um, gun laws were in 1978 about having a shotgun in your truck. So there,
Uh-huh.
but most of it I was familiar with, I guess. Most of it I was already kind of familiar with. I had
Okay.
to look up like what size of a gas tank a 1966 Nova had to build, and then like what were gas prices, but I just used old newspapers for that to figure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you write for a particular audience? Do you address your thoughts to anybody in particular or
That's so funny because I just watched the Kurt Vonnegut documentary the other night, and we've I've been told that he wrote a lot of those books to his sister Alice, who passed early in her adult life. Uh, and I think that's just so lovely. But
Mhm.
I I don't. I kind of, as I'm writing, I want to be told a story, and I'm just watching a movie and watching the people, do what they do in this movie in my head. So I feel like it's more listening than writing in some ways.
Yeah.
And it's, they say it's that old advice of write the story that you want to read or whatever. And I think that that's how I formulate that in my head. It's more like watch the movie that you see in your head. Tell yourself the story that you want to find out about. And that's my guiding principle on that, I think.
So that's really what you want to bring across to people I mean, what's your it's what's in your head. I like that. It's interesting. We get different responses from people, you know.
Oh yeah, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Robert Frost had that line in A Figure a Poem Makes, where he said, no tears in the writer, no tears in the reader, no surprise in the writer, no surprise in the reader. And that's just sort of my, you know, I figure if I get emotionally engaged by it, if I'm excited or scared or upset, um, readers will be too.
Uh-huh.
Uh, but I consider myself a reader as much as any, and a lot of people pointed things out about the book that I had never thought about, which is an amazing experience to me. When other people are like, did you realize that, in the end this happens? And I was like, I didn't realize that it could be read that way, but it can be. And
Oh.
you point it out and I look at it and it's so obvious. So I love that. I
Yeah.
love that.
Do you take part in any, I mean, I know there's writers workshops and collectives. I mean, a writers guild. I mean, do you write and then talk about it with other writers?
Yeah, I mean, I have a few friends who are writers who are really who are great about, really generous with their time, and reading my stuff. No formal groups at this point. When I was getting my MFA and the PhD, I had, workshops, as
Hmm.
often as I could take them, and that was lovely and then wonderful. But you find out in those workshops that there's going to be like two people who are really on your wavelength, and then a lot of just generous, nice people who are reading because it's not their thing.
Uh-huh.
I think that you find your readers, you find those individual people who seem to really get your brain a little
Uh-huh.
bit, and those are the people that I usually end up asking, hey, do you have some time, can you take a look at this? Usually once I have a full draft done is the ideal.
When you do.
Yeah.
So, what impact did writing this book have on you?
Oh, there's so many. Well, for one, it ended up being a debut novel for me that was actually published by this really wonderful, MCD is a part of Farrar Straus Giroux, which is an incredible publisher. So it had that effect. It allowed me to meet a bunch of people. Personally, the act of writing the story, I think a lot of people don't think the book is very funny. Uh, for me, there are moments I had to lighten it up in moments with like Otto Ziski and stuff like that. I had to lighten it up with moments of levity to be able to be in the headspace that it ends up going to. But going to the places, um, that it needed to go to, and I had to rewrite the end 3 times for three
Oh,
different characters because I couldn't take it all in one swoop, like just on an emotional level. I know that sounds weird, but I think I was working a lot of stuff out. Harley, I mean, I identify with all the characters on a level. I think all the characters are just like little slivers of myself, but
mhm.
Harley, his ending actually ended up being like the roughest uh to write for me, and it was just something that I needed to go through, and it was something that I needed to address, that I didn't know I needed to address when I started the book. you know
Mhm.
I think that writing is really good that way. It helps you. A lot of us aren't comfortable writing nonfiction, for instance. It's way easier to like have a buffer and be able to vicariously go through some things that maybe we've gone through someone who isn't us or who doesn't look like us necessarily, who hasn't shared the entire life experience we have. It gives some perspective, I think,
Hmm.
if that makes any
Yeah.
sense.
Since I'm not a writer, I'm always so interested in what people have to say about it. It's still so mysterious to me, writing. So,
Me too. And every book is different. Every book, they say, every story teaches you how to tell it. So I think, one writing process isn't going to get you through 800. Well, it may get you through 800 books if you're the type of person who writes 800 books, but
uh-huh.
it doesn't work for a lot of us. A lot of us have to wing it and do something uh, uncomfortable and try new things when we're writing something new.
So I think I heard you in another interview talking about this genre being rural noir.
I have really mixed feelings about that. I mean, I think, yeah, I think that that can be an inroads, and I think that it can be seen that way. And I appreciate when people do see it that way. Noir, to me, it's just something that, there's a little bit of night to it. There's a little bit of darkness to it, and this book definitely has that. Um, it deals with like very human situational conundrums. I think a lot of noir does, and kind of asks you to look at the parameters of morality and how black and white those are and how much those can shift depending on where a person is in one's life. uh,
Yeah.
I think noir does a lot of that. And I think that you know I think that rural residents, I hope, um can can see and recognize and feel seen in some of it. Maybe they don't want to be. I could understand that too, but there is a problem, I think, with saying rural literature, because we don't often say urban literature, like urban centric, like city literature. Oh, that's city literature. It's like
Mhm.
there's this other division that I think, where regionalism is a really fraught subject, and the idea that like people from rural places just write about, I don't know, simple people or how backwards things are. And that's just not true. Like
Yeah.
people in rural areas have full lives that are just as complicated as anywhere else. And so, um, yeah, it takes place in a rural place, and I hope it gives texture to lives that are really complicated.
Uh-huh. So, okay. So you weren't the one that said it was rural noir. That was like kind of, it was labeled that elsewhere. It sounds like we don't have to keep going on about this, but I'm interested to hear your.
I think that I threw out Nebraska noir at a point, just like as we were brainstorming for
Uh,
like, ideas of what it was. But that was after the fact. I definitely did not sit down and think I'm writing a noir book. Whereas the book that I'm working on now has a private investigator in it. So that's going to be, although I don't know that it's very noir either, to be honest with you. Yeah,
so that kind of jumps a question. But so you are working on something else now,
I
another
am.
novel then? Hmm.
Yeah, I am. I'm working on a book. It's not quite yet titled. I keep going back, which I'm terrible at titles. Those always come toward the end. But it is set in 1929 in Omaha. Uh,
Oh,
yeah, it kind of stemmed from some genealogical research that I had done. I discovered these uncles of mine. One of them was sometimes a small time politician, sometimes a kind of corrupt police officer, and sometimes a prohibition agent. And he and his brother were mixed up in some things that were pretty shady. I mean, it was during prohibition. It was a strange time in Omaha.
mhm.
Um, and I really, but it's also a fascinating time, and a lot of, I think, the underworld elements of it were pretty fascinating, and I think in some ways, I think more socially inclusive. And not to say that there wasn't a lot of bad stuff about it also, but that's the way it goes with everything, I suppose. So it's about that. um, it's about government in Omaha, historical government in Omaha. That comes into play quite a bit. And it's also about just a man who's lost his family, they've left him, and he's, you know, a little past middle age, and he's sort of trying to find his place in the world. And a lot of the reason why he's lost his family is because of choices that he made that he felt were important. Um, and also some things that were a little beyond his control. So yeah.
Well, I look forward to seeing that book. So, okay, I just have one last question, and that is, what would you say to anybody who wants to write and wants to have their works published? Do you have any words of encouragement for them or advice?
Absolutely. I was told just flat out, and I'm glad someone said it to me. They said your chances of going from a query letter to being published by a big publisher are lower than going straight from high school to the NBA. And I was like, that's fine. I don't care. I don't know that I'll ever get published by a major publisher. I don't know if I'll ever get an agent. But I'm just gonna keep doing this. And I figure if I like a story, or if a story, you know, if I enjoy it while I'm writing it, then somebody's out there who's gonna enjoy reading it. Just don't stop. Like, if it the way I look at anything in life is that if you're not hurting someone else, and whatever you're doing is feeding you your intellect and your soul in some way, then just keep doing it. If it makes you unhappy, stop doing it. But you know, just keep doing it. And I think so many writers, I think, get discouraged when people say you need to revise. You can't just write something and then leave it alone. Some writers have historically done that, have just written a story and then not revised it. Others of us find that I'm a person who has to revise a million times. But I love doing the revision because I find that I've planted all these little puzzle pieces everywhere, and my job is, when I'm revising, is to figure out how the puzzle pieces fit together. And I love that. But other people love just getting it on the page. I say just keep doing it and keep doing it. You'll find someone who wants to read it. If you enjoyed writing it, someone will enjoy reading it. It goes back to the Robert Frost thing, I think.
Well, thanks, Chris. Thank you for that. Thank you for this whole interview. And it's really fun to talk with you. So we're just going to move on. I don't know if you need to take a small break to get a drink of water or anything, because we're going to move on to the reading. Yeah, I may be doing that myself. So I know that Chris is going to do a reading for us for, I don't know, 15 or 20 minutes, or however long you feel comfortable.
Okay, that sounds great.
Okay, great.
All right. This I have not figured out on Zoom, how to like look up occasionally. So forgive me if I'm stuck on the page a little bit. Okay. And I'm just going to read from the beginning because to me, that's the easiest part to start with. Deep in the late July night, the headlamps of Harley Jensen's cruiser carved a tunnel of light above Highway 28. They lit the thin tar and chip road and the bunch grass whose shoots ate its crumbling edges. The glare blotted out all else. North central Nebraska, the spot where sand met loam, rose and fell around him, cast black against the shadow of sky. Each night on patrol, Harley absently ticked off names of passing tracks, like reading a plat map in an old atlas. Convention out here held that pastures and fields were named for the living who owned them. Homes and outbuildings huddled within windbreaks, their yards lit by single lampposts, were named for their builders. The only exception was Harley's folks' place, the abandoned farmhouse he now approached and intended to speed right by. Once the windbreak's trees cut a dark mound against the horizon, he'd pass the barn and glance to see the front door still shut. Then he'd sink the gas with the sole of his roper. The Jensen place had been built by a Brosh, and a Brosh owned it now. Before Harley was born there 47 years back, other families lived in the silent two-story, but Jensen was the name that took, which meant there were two systems for naming, Harley supposed: industry or infamy, whichever stuck. A chrome glint flickered in the overgrown yard and tightened his neck. Somebody was parked down by the barn. He passed the house and let the incline slow him to a coast. He made a left onto the gravel of County Road K and stopped. Elbow propped on the window frame, he took a last long drag of the smoke that kept him awake and flicked a shred of tobacco from his tongue. He brushed a knuckle against a sideburn and debated whether or not to keep driving, pretend he hadn't seen anything. The legal drinking age was 19, old enough that high school kids gathered in broken down homesteads dotting the hillsides. Granted, they were generally bright enough to pick a place without highway frontage, certainly one without ties to a deputy who patrolled half the night. But then Harley supposed nothing drew drunk, horny kids so much as a little seediness, some grisly bit of trivia they could spin into full-fledged lore. He wondered what they'd come up with. In his day, rumor had it, the thick cottonwoods lining the quarry, a compound of naked cannibal albinos waited for couples to park on moonlit nights. It'd be tough to beat that. He threw the Fury in reverse, punched the gas to clear the blind intersection quick, and weaved into the house's drive. The tracks were little more than two slight dips in the knee-high grass. Ahead, his low beams caught a snatch of tailgate. Above the wild rye and volunteer ash saplings hovered the dusty bumper of a red F-250, sorry. Paul Reddick. Harley gripped the handset where it clipped to the radio. He held the button, not pressing, but resting. Protocol is to radio in whenever he pulled someone over. Technically, he supposed he wasn't pulling anyone over. He let the handset go. He grabbed the flashlight from the bench seat and tensed at the pop of the door hinge he kept forgetting to WD-40. He stood in the brush and trained the beam on the pickup's back window. The old 12-gauge Winchester lay in the rack behind Paul's dirt-colored hair, which hung well past his shoulders. From the open driver's side door, a tan and veined forearm jutted like it was signaling a right-hand turn. Its fist flipped Harley the bird. Reddick, Harley acknowledged. Paul dropped the middle finger and let his arm dangle from the window. Jensen floated back just as how do you do. That how do you do-ness, that unshakable calm made Harley's teeth grit. It wasn't composure, and it wasn't reserve. Harley knew a good bit about composure and reserve himself. What Paul had was the hostile indifference of a person who valued nothing, the kind of rarefied spite that came from never having known a single thing he'd mind losing. It no doubt stemmed from a brother dying 18 years back when Paul was surely too young to even remember him. In Paul's case, Harley thought not remembering was probably worse. All Paul would have known was the wake of it. Dell Jr., the oldest of three Reddick boys, was 7 when he was killed by a farmhand named Raleigh Asher. Dell Jr. caught Raleigh off guard while he was shoveling dirt into a collapsed cellar at the old Lucas place. Raleigh hadn't been right since Korea. He caved in the boy's skull, called the sheriff to say he'd done it, then blew a load of buckshot through his own. All Raleigh neglected to mention was where he put the body. The summer of '60, Harley and the department searched every vacant building, scoured every grain of dirt in the fields and ditches, never found him. They'd found the spade, matted with hair and skin. They'd found a spot of earth soaked in more blood than Harley knew could course through a 7-year-old boy. Just no body. Sometimes Harley suspected if the department had found that body, the Reddicks might have fared better. Maybe the mother, Virginia, wouldn't have become a shut-in. Maybe Dell Sr. wouldn't have moved out and left the 2 young boys as her caretakers. If the department had just found that body, maybe Paul's sense of the size and the gravity of things, of knowing how and when to be phased, would have been halfway normal. As it stood, not a whole hell of a lot qualified. Harley's boots moved forward, flattening the grass and grinding the dirt till a movement in the cab stopped him. He rubbed the holster's thumb brake. Another head, this one covered in long, crumpled blonde curls, surfaced from the seat. A pair of eyes sleepily squinted back at him. A girl 16, maybe. Paul had to be bordering on 22 by now. It was worth a check. At the open window, Harley trained his light on Paul, who didn't squint. Instead, his head tilted back as if he were studying the glare through a pair of bifocals. The angle made his hard-set jaw look more square than it already was. His silver gray eyes held steady, unblinking. Sightseeing? Harley asked. Getting a little air. The words seemed to touch too loud and affected the pitch, not the volume. Paul's voice was clear and low. While I'm still on the right side of the sod. It was a quip old men would exchange at a feed store, but then the only thing young about Paul was the age on his license. The hairline cracks at the edges of his eyes, lines from working in the sun and wind, resembled crow's feet. Time being, at least, Harley said. Sounds pretty foreboding. Paul glanced away easily without a trace of readable meaning toward the house. In profile, his bones were thick, prominent, so much so they seemed ready to surface and split the skin. The flashlight shadowed the dark hollows below Paul's deep-set eyes, between his cheekbone and jaw. Kindly step from the vehicle. Paul looked down in his lap and busied himself with his hands. Harley nudged the holster brake with a snap. The rasp of the zipper's teeth filtered from the cab in reply. The pickup door opened and Harley watched for Paul to blink at the dome light stuttering on. Nothing. Paul slipped his hands in his pockets of his too tight jeans and strolled through the knee-high grass toward the house. His threadbare black t-shirt faded into the night's darkness, a whiff of brute aftershave lingering on the air behind him. Harley gripped the wheel and used the running board to hoist himself into the driver's seat. He turned the beam on the girl, although the overhead made her clear enough. She was wide-eyed, pinching her bottom lip between her thumb and forefinger. You here of your own volition? He asked her. She sat there dumb and dazed as a sleepwalker. I said you out here on purpose? The girl said nothing. He shifted the light from pupil to pupil. They worked fine. Harley reached across the cab and pressed a button on the glove box. The compartment fell open with a thud. Ain't nothing in there, Paul called out, more or less jovially. There probably wasn't. Once there'd been a half bottle of Quaaludes prescribed to Paul's mother, but Glenn, the sheriff, flushed them. Glenn told Harley to forget it. That poor woman had enough problems. What exactly those problems were was a matter of small-town speculation, since she never came out of her house. There was nothing in the glove box besides the registration and some coarse paper napkins. Rifling through Paul Reddick's F-250 always felt about as productive as clipping off the lit end of a fuse. Even if it put the spark out, Harley sensed the fuse getting shorter each time. Across the way, Paul swung a foot, not kicking, but swiping his worn motorcycle boot through the grass like he was searching half-heartedly between the blades. Stop by for old time's sake? He asked. Saw your pickup, Harley told him, running his flashlight beam over the dash, the floor, the seat. Thought I'd make sure nobody lost a foot or got brained on a rock yet. The silhouette of Paul's head was shrouded in hair long, so long it looked hooded. It bobbed in agreement. My burden, apparently. I know it. Always bearing witness. Just a bad penny, huh? Harley said. You know you turn up often enough, wrong place, wrong time, you seem less like an omen than a reason. Got any evidence to that effect, Deputy? Harley didn't. He wished to hell he did. He turned to the girl again. He asked her age. 17, she said. She probably was. Her back had shrunk to the corner of the seat and passenger side door. She looked repentant like a child, but given the cut of her cheeks and her shape draped beneath a thin Wilton Panthers t-shirt, she was old enough to know better. Harley asked for her ID. The girl's forehead shriveled into folds. She stammered she'd snuck out, forgot her purse, that her parents would kill her. Her shoulders racked with a sob that crumpled her toward him across the seat. He flinched and slid away. He grabbed the wheel to keep from falling out the open driver's side door, and his elbow nailed the horn. The loud clip blare rang through the quiet. Harley didn't care for being touched, not unexpectedly. If Paul was concerned about the horn, he didn't mention it. Nah, he said in answer to some question Harley hadn't asked. Don't guess you stop by the home place much if you can help it. A deep breath burned in Harley's lungs. He held it there. He told the girl to pull herself together, go wait in the cruiser. When her sniffling bubbled into a panic stammer again, he told her to calm down. He didn't want to deal with some idiot girl's parents at 4 a.m. any more than she did. He'd drop her a block from the house and she could take her chances sneaking back in. She got out of the cab and went to the cruiser to wait. Paul kept talking offhandedly. How'd she do it again? Gun? Hanging? Harley slid down from the seat. He held the burning breath tight in his chest and walked across the yard to Reddick's black outline. Guess that's why you stopped by. Figured I wouldn't, knowing I'd drive right by on patrol. Paul sighed a breath. Don't read into it. I misplaced something is all. Thought it might have drifted out this way. Surely you've done that. Lost something. Drove yourself half nuts looking for it. He gave a pause, perfunctory, not waiting for a reply. Been all over this evening. Here's where I happened to land, where our paths crossed. It's happenstance, Harley. No accounting for fate. The flashlight bled a long oblong mist across the grass and toward the house, toward the kitchen windows. Harley didn't look there. He kept his focus on Paul's dark figure. With the yard's incline, he stood a hair taller than Harley. Seemed distracted. Paul craned his head back to look back at the house. Let yourself in then? Have a look inside? There's a root cellar out back. You check there? Now, that'd be trespassing. You ought to know I learned my lesson about trespassing. The night of the water tower, he meant. That'd have been the charge in the end, trespassing. For an instant, Harley pictured Paul dangling upside down in the flat tower's floodlights, barrels of the Winchester trained toward Harley and the cruiser below. You're trespassing just parked here, Harley said. I'm seeing if we can tack on breaking and entering. Paul's voice briefly lowered. It took on a tone of discretion. I suppose you'll need to call Brosh then, see if he wants to press charges. Lauren Brosh owns the place now, don't he? The flashlight's glow had crept upward a touch. The waved pane of a kitchen window winked back. Harley pushed the beam down again. Want to say what you're looking for? I would not, Paul said, if it's all the same to you. Not that county law enforcement sleuthing expertise wouldn't be helpful, of course. Harley wanted to grip him by the Adam's apple and shake the nonchalance right out of him. Leave, he said instead. Paul looked skyward. Harley thought he might have squinted a bit before his gaze dropped back to the shadows. Oh, no. I wasn't insinuating. You always think I'm insinuating. You need to let some shit go, Harley. You don't let that shit go, it'll give you ulcers. Leave. Paul stayed put a beat, then ambled toward the cab. He hopped in and closed the door. Harley followed and trained the flashlight beam on his face again. Under the low-hanging lids, the beam shrank Paul's pupils to little pits of irises drilled in like aluminum funnels, like they'd been carved out by the light. But Paul didn't flinch. He never flinched. Not when his nighttime game of chicken left the Sawyer kid crawling in a ditch, feeling alongside a flip Chevelle for his severed foot. Not when the Ferguson girl on a dare missed the quarry water and dove headfirst into dry granite. Paul was the only kid out there not frantic or vaguely giddy. Pretty clean, he deemed it. Not near as gourd-like as you'd think. He hadn't flinched that night at the water tower either. Harley saw then. There wasn't something off about Paul Reddick. There was something too on. He was too lucid for anyone's goddamn good. I don't want to see you here again, Harley told him. Nope. Paul stared straight into Harley's eyes, though he couldn't have made them out past the glare. Can't imagine you do. The keyring jangled and the engine churned to life. Reddick pulled out in a broad curve, no hurry, tires rolling over what was once a yard, nicking the corner of what was once a carefully tended flower bed. The hairs on Harley's arms and the back of his neck rose in needle pricks. The Ford passed, and the taillights brightened where the drive met the highway. The pickup turned right and passed through the blind intersection. It disappeared over the hill. When his eyes adjusted to the stars, Harley saw his shadow was missing, swallowed by the house that loomed at his back. He walked slowly to where the cruiser shone in the moon.
Chris, that was great. You do a great job reading.
Thank you. I stammer a little bit. I get a little stammery, but thank you.
Well,
thank you.
Those characters are just so vivid. So it was really nice to hear it read to me now. So thank you very much.
Yeah.